By sunrise in 1909, somewhere east of Holbrook, Arizona, the shepherd dog walked back through the freight camp on his own. A sable-coated animal named Rook, steady as iron, known for working quiet and sleeping light. He came back shaking so hard his identification tags clicked against the brass ring on his collar, a sound the men would later say they heard from 20 paces off. His coat was dusted white as if he'd rolled in alkali or lime, though no one in that camp kept either. His paw pads were clean. Not a trace of grit, not a smear of red dust. Not a single thorn caught in the webbing between his toes. And the ground around him where he collapsed just past the chuck wagon showed no prints at all. Not dog, not man, not bird. Just smoothed sand, as if something had erased him from the earth and set him back down without ever letting him touch it. Men in Arizona still won't talk about that stretch of dry wash before daylight. They'll tell you it was the heat. They'll tell you it was a bad season for water. But if you press them, if you wait long enough in the shade of a loading barn or a feed store, they'll tell you about Rook and about the week in April when a good dog came back wrong and then disappeared again, leaving only his collar behind, warm as if a living hand had just unbuckled it. The freight crew had been camped 3 miles east of Holbrook for most of that month, hauling goods south from the rail depot to a string of scattered homesteads and a mission school near the edge of Navajo land. It was open country, flat and thorned, cut through by a shallow arroyo the men called the Wash. No name on any map, just a groove in the ground where snowmelt ran in spring and where, in drier months, the freighters watered their mules from seep pools that gathered slow between the rocks. The Wash ran east to west for maybe 2 miles, then curved south and disappeared into harder ground where nothing grew but greasewood and prickly pear. The banks were low, no more than 8 feet at the deepest point, and the bottom was sand mixed with gravel and chunks of pale limestone that looked like old bone in the early light. Rook belonged to a man named Callan, a wiry Irishman in his 50s who ran the second wagon and kept the dog tied near his bedroll at night. Rook was 3 years old, trained from a pup to work stock and guard gear, and Callan trusted him more than he trusted most people. The dog slept on a short chain looped to the wagon tongue, and every man in camp knew that if Rook barked, you listened. He was not a dog that startled easy. He had worked cattle drives in Oklahoma, worked freight hauls through Navajo country, worked nights when the coyotes came close and the mules stamped nervous in their pickets. He knew his job, and he knew his man. Callan fed him from his own plate most nights, let him sleep near the fire when the cold came down hard, and spoke to him the way some men speak to family. On the morning of April 9th, just before first light, Rook slipped his collar. No one saw it happen. Callan woke to find the leather strap still buckled tight, the chain still looped around the wagon tongue, and the dog gone. He cursed under his breath, pulled on his boots, and scanned the camp. The other men were stirring. Coffee water was heating over coals that glowed dull red in the pre-dawn gray. One of the mules shifted and blew, rattling the picket line, but otherwise the camp sat quiet under a sky the color of old pewter. Then, from the direction of the Wash, they heard a single bark, sharp, cut short, and then nothing. Callan walked toward the sound, calling Rook's name. 2 other men followed, Sepulveda, the youngest hand, barely 18, and a heavy-set teamster named Boone who carried a rifle out of habit more than need. They reached the edge of the arroyo and stood looking down into the gully where the mules drank. The air smelled like dust and creosote and something faintly metallic. The way air smells before a storm, though there were no clouds and no wind, a faint breeze moved through the brush, just enough to rattle the dry seed pods on the mesquite, and then it stopped. In the stillness that followed, they heard the mule chain rattle, a metallic clink, distinct and deliberate, like someone had lifted it and let it drop. But there was no wind, and no animal in sight. The 3 men climbed down into the Wash, boots sliding in loose sand. They moved careful, eyes scanning the ground, the brush, the shadowed places under the overhang where the bank had crumbled. The chain lay coiled neat on a flat stone, exactly where it had been staked the night before to hold the water bucket. Nothing disturbed, nothing dragged. The bucket itself sat upright nearby, half full, surface still as glass. Boone knelt and touched the sand around the stone. Dry, undisturbed, no prints. Rook did not come when called. The men searched the arroyo for an hour, walking the sandy bottom in both directions, checking behind boulders and through the thickets of willow and tamarisk that grew where water pooled after rain. They found no prints, no scat, no disturbed ground, no sign the dog had been there at all. By the time they climbed back to camp, the sun had cleared the horizon, and the day had started to warm. The sky turned pale blue, hard and empty, and the heat rose fast off the flat ground. Callan stood by the wagon, hands on his hips, jaw tight. He did not say much. He poured himself coffee from the pot and sat with his back to the fire, watching the line of thorny scrub that marked the edge of the wash. And he waited. At noon, Rook came back. He staggered into camp from the south, legs unsteady, head low, eyes unfocused. His whole body shook, a tremor that started deep in his chest and ran through his legs and tail in violent waves. His coat, normally a dark sable brown streaked with black along the spine, was covered in fine white dust. It clung to his fur in patches, thick as flour. And when one of the men, Sepp Ulveda, reached out to brush it off, the dog flinched hard and pulled away, lips curling back just enough to show teeth. Rook would not let anyone touch him. Not Callan, not the cook, an older Mexican man named Reyes who had fed Rook scraps since the dog first joined the crew, not Sepulveda, who had slept beside the animal on cold nights and scratched his ears by the fire. Rook stood in the center of camp, shaking, staring past the men toward the mesquite thicket as if something stood there in the shade, unseen, counting breaths. His eyes were wide, pupils blown, and his ears lay flat against his skull. Callan knelt in the dirt and spoke to him soft, the way you talk to a spooked horse. But Rook did not respond. He did not wag. He did not whine. He just stared. They brought him water in a tin pan. He would not drink. They brought him jerky and a piece of salt pork. He turned his head. Callan tried to check him for injury, running his hands gently over the dog's legs and ribs, but Rook pulled away again and moved toward the wagon. When the sun started to drop and the shadows stretched long across the camp, Rook crawled beneath the chuck wagon and curled tight against the wheel, body pressed into the sand. He made a sound then, low and continuous, a keening that rose and fell like wind through a gap in stone. It was not a howl. It was not a whimper. It was something older, something men in Arizona would later say sounded like grief, though they could not say for what. By dawn on the 10th, Rook was gone again. His collar lay folded on the wagon tongue, leather soft and still warm to the touch, the brass buckle polished so bright it caught the early light like a mirror. Callan found it first. He picked it up slow, turned it over in his hands, held it to the light. The brass was clean, not tarnished, not scratched, polished smooth, as if someone had worked it with a cloth and oil until it shone. The leather showed no wear where the buckle had been fastened. It looked new. But Rook had worn that collar for 3 years, and Callan knew every crease, every stain, every place the stitching had frayed. This was the same collar, but it was not. No one had touched it. No one had been near the wagon during the night. The camp had posted 2 men on watch, rotating every 3 hours, and both swore they saw nothing, heard nothing, felt nothing, but the cold that comes before sunrise in high desert country. Boone had walked the perimeter twice. Reyes had sat by the fire, feeding it mesquite branches and watching the shadows. Neither man heard a dog move. Neither saw a shape leave camp, and yet by first light, Rook was gone and the collar remained warm as living skin. The men tied red cloth strips to greasewood stakes and walked the arroyo in a line, shoulder to shoulder, calling Rook's name. They moved slow, methodical, checking every shadow, every cleft in the stone, every place a dog might crawl to hide or die. The air that morning did not move. Lantern smoke hung in columns, thick and gray, refusing to disperse in air that should have scattered it. At milepost 9, where the freight road crossed the wash at a shallow ford, they found the tin water bucket sitting upright on a flat stone. It had been left there 2 days prior by Sepulveda, who used it to water his horse on the return trip from a supply run. Now it clinked, a soft, rhythmic sound, metal on rock, as if something dipped into it and set it down gently, over and over, for hours. The men stood listening. The sound continued. Steady. Patient. One of them, Boone, stepped forward and kicked the bucket over. It rolled into the sand with a hollow clatter and stopped. The clinking stopped too. No one picked it up. No one touched it again. After that week, the freight crews working east of Holbrook, Arizona, changed how they operated. They posted guards at both ends of the wash during the hours before dawn. No man crossed alone. No dog ran loose after dark. And when the moon sat low and the air turned still the way it does in that country before the wind picks up at sunrise, the older hands told the younger ones, "You don't answer if you hear something call your name from past the arroyo. You don't go looking for what doesn't want to be found. And you don't touch anything that comes back warm." The timeline made no sense from the start. Callan tried to piece it together that first afternoon, sitting in the shade of the wagon with a pencil stub and a scrap of paper, writing down what each man remembered. The cook said he'd heard Rook bark once, sharp, maybe 20 minutes before sunrise. Boone said it was closer to 30. Sepulveda swore he'd heard the mule chain rattle right after the bark, but Reyes said the chain sound came first, and the bark followed. No one could agree, and when they tried to mark the time Rook came back at noon, they found their pocket watches didn't match. Callan's read 12:14. Boone's read 11:58. Sepulveda didn't own a watch, but he said the sun had been straight overhead, no shadow under the wagon wheel, which meant it should have been closer to 1 o'clock that time of year in Arizona. "Something's wrong with the hour," Callan said that night, quiet to Boone. They were standing near the picket line checking the mules. Rook was gone maybe 6 hours, but it feels longer. Boone nodded. He didn't argue. Men who work freight in open country learn to trust their gut about time and distance, and both of them felt the same pull, the same sense that the day had stretched thin in places and bunched up in others like cloth caught on a nail. By the third day, the whole crew knew something had followed Rook back. They didn't say it out loud, not at first, but they felt it. Small things started going wrong. A coil of rope that had been hung on a peg appeared on the ground 15 feet away, knotted in a pattern no one recognized. A tin plate left by the fire was found the next morning balanced on edge against a wagon wheel, standing upright in sand too loose to hold it. One of the mules, an older mare named Belle, refused to drink from the bucket they'd brought up from the wash. She'd arch her neck, pull back hard on the lead, and roll her eyes white if anyone tried to force her near it. Reyes finally poured the water out and refilled the bucket from a different seep pool half a mile west. Belle drank then, no problem. On the fourth day, they organized a real search. Not just 3 men walking the arroyo with rifles, but a proper grid sweep, the kind you do when you're looking for a body. 6 men spaced 10 feet apart, walking north to south across the wash and the flats beyond. They tied strips of red cloth to greasewood stakes every 100 yards to mark the line, and they moved slow, eyes on the ground. Callan walked point. Boone and Sepulveda flanked him. The other 3, Reyes, a silent Swede named Halverson, and a drifter they called Pitch because his hands were always black with tar, followed behind. They found Rook's prints in the sand about a quarter mile south of camp. 4 clear paw prints, spaced natural, heading toward the wash. And then nothing. The prints stopped mid-stride as if the dog had been lifted straight up into the air. Callan knelt and touched the edge of one print. The sand was cool, undisturbed. He looked up at Boone. "Wind?" Boone asked. Callan shook his head. "Wind doesn't stop in a straight line." They kept walking. 200 yards farther, they found another set of prints. Same size, same dog. But these were coming back toward camp, and they were wrong. The toes pointed forward, but the stride was backward, heel first, as if something had walked in reverse without turning around. Sepulveda saw them first and stopped so fast Halverson nearly walked into him. "Don't step on them," Sepulveda said, voice tight. The men gathered around. No one spoke. The prints ran for maybe 20 feet, clean and deliberate, and then they vanished again. Just smoothed sand, no scuff, no drag, nothing. That night, they heard the whistle. It came from the direction of the wash, low and clear, 2 notes rising and falling. A shepherd's whistle, the kind used to call a dog or turn stock. Callan sat up fast, heart hammering. He knew that whistle. He'd used it himself 1,000 times. He opened his mouth to call out, then stopped, because the whistle came again, from a different direction. North this time, instead of south. Same 2 notes. Same rhythm. And then a third time, from the east, past the mesquite line. Boone was already on his feet, rifle in hand. "That's not a man," he said. "No," Callan agreed. "It's not." The whistle stopped. The camp went silent. Even the mules stood still, ears pricked forward, staring into the dark. Then, from somewhere close, maybe 30 yards out, maybe less, they heard a sound like claws on stone. Slow, scraping, moving in a circle around the camp. Boone raised the rifle, sighted into the black, but there was nothing to aim at. Just sound, just movement they couldn't see. "Light the lamps," Callan said. They lit every lantern they had and hung them from the wagon frames and the picket posts, turning the camp into a ring of yellow light that pushed back the dark maybe 40 feet in every direction. Beyond that, nothing. Just the flat black of open desert and the shadows of sage and thorn that could have been anything. The scraping sound stopped. But the feeling didn't. The feeling that something stood just outside the light, patient, watching. The older men in the crew, Reyes and Halverson, started talking in low voices about rules. Things you didn't do in country like this. Halverson said his father had freighted through Montana Territory in the 1870s. And told him you never camped near a dry wash after dark, because the land there didn't rest the way other land did. Reyes said his grandfather, who'd worked cattle in Sonora, told him the same thing. Water that comes and goes leaves a door open, and not everything that uses the door is natural. "We should move camp," Reyes said. "Where?" Callan asked. "We've got contracts, we've got a schedule." "Doesn't matter," Reyes said. "We should move." But they didn't move. Not that night. They stayed, and they kept the lamps burning until the oil ran low and the wicks started to smoke. Just before dawn, when the sky turned the color of ash and the stars faded, they heard the bucket again. The same soft clinking, metal on stone, coming from the direction of milepost 9. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, steady as a heartbeat, and then it stopped. When the sun came up, Sepulveda and Pitch walked out to check the post. The bucket was gone. In its place, someone had stacked 3 smooth stones in a cairn, each one balanced perfectly on top of the other. The stones were warm, not sun-warm, warm like they'd been held. On the 6th day, one of the red cloth markers they'd tied to a greasewood stake disappeared. Boone had placed it himself, knotted it tight, double-checked the branch. When they passed the same spot that afternoon, the cloth was gone and a different strip, white, not red, hung in its place. No one in the crew carried white cloth. They checked. Callan untied the strip and held it up to the light. It was clean, new. The edges weren't frayed. It looked like it had been torn fresh from a bolt of cotton and tied in the last hour. "Where did this come from?" he asked. No one answered. That night, they moved camp. Not far, just a mile west, away from the wash, but far enough that they couldn't see the arroyo from where they slept. They posted 2 guards armed, one at each end of the camp, and told them not to answer if they heard anything call out from the dark. The rules were forming now, unspoken but understood. Don't go to the wash alone. Don't follow sounds you can't see. Don't touch things that shouldn't be warm. And don't, under any circumstance, go looking for Rook. On the 7th morning, Callan found the collar again. It was sitting on his bedroll, centered perfectly, as if someone had placed it there with care. The brass buckle gleamed. The leather was soft, and it was warm. He picked it up, hands shaking, and stared at it. Then he looked around the camp. Every man was awake. Every man was watching him. No one said a word. Boone broke the silence. "We don't cross the wash before sunrise anymore. Not for water, not for anything." The men agreed. It wasn't a vote. It wasn't a debate. It was survival. And somewhere past the mesquite line, just beyond the ring of stones at milepost 9, they heard a dog bark once. Sharp, familiar, and then nothing. By the 8th day, the search had stopped being about finding Rook and started being about proving to themselves they could still control something. The men walked the same ground over and over, tying new markers, checking old ones, dragging hooks through the shallow pools in the wash even though they knew a dog wouldn't drown in 8 inches of water. They worked in pairs now, no exceptions, Callan and Boone, Sepulveda and Reyes, Halverson and Pitch. They carried rifles and canteens and pocket watches they checked obsessively, comparing the time every hour as if that might anchor them to something solid. The freight schedule had gone to hell. They'd missed 2 deliveries already, and the mission school sent a rider asking where their supplies were. Callan told the rider they'd had trouble with a dog and were delayed. The rider, a young Navajo man who spoke careful English and kept his eyes on the horizon, looked at Callan for a long moment and then asked, "Trouble near the wash?" Callan nodded. The rider didn't ask anything else. He turned his horse and left, and they didn't see him again. On the 9th day, they found something that made everything worse. Sepulveda was walking the north side of the arroyo with Reyes, checking the markers they'd placed 3 days prior, when he saw a piece of paper wedged into a crack in the stone bank. It was folded once, tucked neat into a gap maybe 4 feet off the ground, sheltered from wind and rain. Sepulveda pulled it out and unfolded it. The paper was clean, no dirt, no water damage, just a single line written in pencil, slanted and tight, the letters pressed hard into the page. "Check the fence line." Sepulveda stared at it. His hand started to shake. He turned to Reyes, who was standing a few feet back, and held up the paper. "Is this his?" Reyes asked. "I don't know," Sepulveda said, but his voice cracked, and they both knew he was lying. They brought the note back to camp. Callan took it, read it, and went very still. He walked to his wagon, pulled out a wooden crate from under the seat, and dug through a stack of receipts and bills of lading until he found what he was looking for. A delivery receipt Rook's previous owner had signed when Callan bought the dog 3 years ago. The man's name had been Tierney, and he'd written out the dog's lineage and training history on the back of the receipt in pencil. Same slanted hand, same heavy pressure on the downstrokes. Callan held the receipt next to the note. The handwriting didn't match. Not exactly. But it was close. Close enough that if you squinted, if you wanted to believe, you could convince yourself it was the same handwriting under strain, or in dim light, or in a hurry. "That's not possible," Boone said, reading over Callan's shoulder. "I know. Tierney's been dead 2 years, and even if he wasn't, why would he leave a note about a fence line in the middle of nowhere?" Callan didn't answer. He folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket, and he didn't take it out again, but the words stayed with them. "Check the fence line." The problem was, there was no fence line. Not out here. The nearest fence was 6 miles south, marking the boundary of a homestead they'd delivered to the week before. There was no reason to check it, no reason to go back, but the note said to check it, and that night, lying awake under a sky so full of stars it looked like salt spilled on black cloth, Callan couldn't stop thinking about it. On the 10th day, he and Boone rode south to the homestead. They didn't tell the others where they were going. They just saddled 2 horses and left at dawn, following the freight road through flat country that shimmered in the heat. The homestead belonged to a man named Chetley, a bachelor who ran a few head of cattle and kept to himself. When Callan and Boone arrived, Chetley was sitting on his porch, mending a bridle. "You boys lost?" Chetley asked. "No," Callan said, "just checking something." They rode the fence line. It ran east to west for maybe half a mile. 4 strands of barbed wire strung between cedar posts, sagging in places but mostly intact. They found nothing unusual. No breaks, no tracks, no sign anything had been there. They were about to turn back when Boone's horse stopped and refused to go farther. Boone nudged it with his heels. The horse shook its head and backed up 3 steps. "Easy," Boone said, patting its neck. He dismounted and walked forward on foot, leading the animal. 10 feet ahead, he stopped. "Callan." Callan rode up beside him and looked down. There, lying in the dirt at the base of a fence post, was a second collar, identical to Rook's. Same leather, same brass buckle, Same wear pattern along the strap where it had been fastened and unfastened 1,000 times. Callan dismounted, knelt, and picked it up. It was warm. Not just sun-warm. Warm like it had been worn. "How many collars did he have?" Boone asked, voice tight. "One," Callan said. "Just one." They stared at each other. Boone looked back toward the camp, then at the fence line, then at the collar in Callan's hand. "We need to leave," he said. "Where?" "Anywhere that isn't here." They rode back to camp and showed the others. Reyes crossed himself. Halverson set down the tin cup he was holding and walked away without saying a word. Pitch asked if they were sure it was the same collar, and Callan said yes, he was sure, because he'd carved a small notch in the buckle the first week he'd owned Rook to tell it apart from another dog's gear, and the notch was there on both collars, identical, in the exact same place. That night, no one slept. They sat around the fire, passing a bottle of whiskey Reyes had been saving, and they talked. Not about what they'd seen, no one wanted to say it out loud, but about other things, about dogs they'd known, about freight routes they'd worked, about the strange things men see when they spend too much time alone in open country. Someone said maybe Rook had run off and gotten himself killed, and something else had picked up the collar and moved it around. Someone else said maybe there'd been 2 dogs all along and no one had noticed. But nobody believed it. Not really. Around midnight, Sepulveda spoke up. He'd been quiet most of the night, sitting with his back to the wagon, staring into the fire. "My grandmother used to say some places remember things," he said. "She said water that comes and goes carries memory, and if you camp near it too long, the memory gets into you." "That's superstition," Pitch said. "Maybe," Sepulveda said, "but I've been hauling freight through Arizona for 2 years, and I've never seen anything like this." "You think the wash took the dog?" Reyes asked. "I think something did, and I think it's still here." The fire cracked. A log split and collapsed into coals. The men sat in silence, listening to the night. No wind, no animal sounds. Just the faint hiss of mesquite wood burning and the distant empty dark pressing in from all sides. On the 11th day, Callan put both collars in a wooden box, nailed it shut, and buried it 2 feet deep at the edge of camp. He didn't mark the spot. He didn't tell anyone where it was. He just dug the hole, dropped the box in, covered it, and walked away. That afternoon, when he came back from checking the mules, the box was sitting on top of his bedroll, unopened. The dirt still packed tight in the seams. He picked it up, felt the weight of it, and threw it as hard as he could into the arroyo. It hit the sand at the bottom and disappeared. The next morning, it was back. The men held a meeting, not formal, just a circle near the fire. Everyone standing, no one willing to sit. Boone said they should break camp and head back to Holbrook, file a report, let someone else deal with it. Halverson said no one would believe them. Reyes said it didn't matter if anyone believed them. They just needed to leave. Callan didn't say anything. He stood with his arms crossed, staring at the box, and when the others looked at him for an answer, he shook his head. "We finish the route," he said. "We deliver the loads, and then we don't come back." "And the dog?" Sepulveda asked. Callan looked at him. "The dog's gone. They worked fast after that, loaded the wagons, checked the harnesses, filled the water barrels from a different seep pool 5 miles west, one they'd never used before. They left the markers in the ground, the red cloth flapping in the wind, and they didn't look back at the wash as they pulled out. By sunset, they were camped 10 miles south, in open country with no arroyo, no gully, no water that came and went. The men posted guards anyway, 2 at a time, rotating every 2 hours, and they kept the fire burning all night, fed with dry mesquite that popped and hissed and filled the air with smoke thick enough to sting your eyes. Around 3 in the morning, Callan woke to the sound of clinking. Soft, rhythmic, metal on stone. He sat up fast, heart pounding, and looked around. The camp was quiet. The guards were awake, rifles across their laps. The fire burned low but steady, and there, sitting upright in the sand 10 feet from where he slept, was the tin bucket from milepost 9. It rocked gently back and forth, tapping against a stone, though there was no wind, and no hand to move it. No one touched it. No one went near it. When the sun came up, the bucket was still there, and it stayed there for 3 days, rocking on its own, until finally, Pitch poured coal oil over it and set it on fire. It burned fast, the metal warping and blackening, and when the flames died, they buried the remains and piled stones on top. After that, men working freight east of Holbrook, Arizona, started telling the new hires, "You don't camp near the wash. You don't water your stock there after dark. And if you hear something that sounds like a dog or a whistle or metal tapping stone, you don't go looking. You keep moving, because some things don't let go, even when you try to leave them behind." Alan finished the route. It took another week, and every night he woke to sounds that shouldn't have been there. Scraping, clinking, the soft 2-note whistle drifting in from the dark. But nothing came into camp. Nothing touched them. It was as if whatever had taken Rook had decided to let them go, as long as they kept moving. When they finally rolled back into Holbrook in late April, the men unloaded the wagons in silence, collected their pay, and scattered. Sepulveda headed north to work a ranch in Utah. Pitch disappeared and no one asked where. Halverson signed on with a different freight company and made it clear he wouldn't haul loads east of town anymore, not for any price. Reyes went back to Mexico and didn't come back. Callan stayed. He kept working freight, kept running loads south, but he changed his routes. He'd swing wide, adding miles to every trip just to avoid the stretch of road that ran near the wash. Other freighters noticed. A few asked why. Callan told them the water was bad there, which was true enough. The ones who pressed him for details got a look that made them stop asking. And the ones who didn't listen, who camped near the arroyo anyway because it was convenient, because the water was easy to reach, came back with stories of their own. Dogs that wouldn't settle. Mules that stamped and pulled at their pickets all night. Sounds that didn't match anything they knew. Most of them only camped there once. By summer, the story had spread. Not in newspapers or official reports, but the way stories spread among men who work alone in hard country. Quiet, over coffee, in the shade of a loading dock or the back room of a feed store. They didn't call it a haunting. They didn't use words like ghost or devil. They just said the wash was bad ground and you didn't camp there. And if you had to cross it, you did it in daylight with another man beside you. It became a rule the same way other rules become fixed in places where survival depends on paying attention. You don't ride a green horse in a lightning storm. You don't drink from a stock tank that's gone still. And you don't camp near the wash east of Holbrook. The mission school stopped requesting deliveries that required crossing that stretch of road. They rerouted their supply line through a longer route to the west, and when the territorial government asked why, the school's administrator, a Jesuit priest named Father Duce, wrote back saying the road was unreliable and the terrain difficult for wagons. He didn't mention the wash. He didn't mention Rook. But in his private journal, which was found years later in the archive of a Santa Fe library, he wrote, "The men will not go there, and I cannot blame them. There are places in this territory that do not welcome human presence, and wisdom lies in acknowledging that." Callan kept the first collar, the one that had appeared on his bedroll that 7th morning, wrapped in oilcloth in a trunk in his room at a boarding house in Holbrook. He didn't look at it often, but sometimes late at night when the wind rattled the window frames and the house settled into silence, he'd open the trunk and touch the leather just to see if it was still warm. It never was. Cold as any other piece of tack. But every time he checked, he half expected it to be otherwise. In 1912, 3 years after Rook disappeared, a surveyor working for the railroad came through Holbrook and asked about the area east of town. He was mapping a potential rail extension and wanted to know if there was water along the route. Callan, by then in his late 50s and still freighting part-time, told him there was a wash with seasonal seep pools, but he wouldn't recommend it. The surveyor asked why. Callan didn't answer directly, he just said, "Ask around, you'll hear." The surveyor did ask around, and what he heard made him adjust his map. The proposed rail line shifted 2 miles north, avoiding the wash entirely. In his report to the railroad company, he noted that local residents considered the area unsuitable for permanent infrastructure due to irregular water flow and unstable soil conditions. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. By 1920, The freight camps had moved on. Trucks were replacing wagons, and the old trails through open country were giving way to graded roads that followed different routes. But the stories didn't stop. A ranch hand working cattle near the Wash in the summer of 1923 reported finding a dog collar hanging from a fence post that hadn't been there the day before. He described it as old leather with a brass buckle, warm to the touch even though the morning was cool. He left it where it was. A schoolteacher driving through the area in 1931 had her car engine die at the exact spot where the freight road crossed the arroyo. The engine wouldn't turn over. She sat there for 2 hours in the heat, and just as she was about to walk back to town, the engine started on its own. She drove straight through without stopping, and later told her sister she'd heard something clinking in the distance the whole time she sat there, like metal on stone, rhythmic and patient. In 1945, a group of boys from Holbrook rode their bicycles out to the Wash on a dare. They were 12, maybe 13, old enough to think they were brave. They camped there overnight with a tent and a flashlight and a bag of sandwiches their mothers had packed. Around midnight, they heard a dog bark. Just once. Sharp. Close. They called out, thinking it was a stray. The bark came again, from a different direction. Then a third time, from behind them. The boys packed up and rode home in the dark, and not one of them ever went back. One of those boys, a man named Ernesto Salazar, still lives in Holbrook. He's in his 90s now. And when people ask him about that night, he says, "We heard what we heard, and we left. That's all." The collar appeared one more time in 1958, nearly 50 years after Rook disappeared. A highway crew was widening the road that ran south from Holbrook, grading the shoulder and clearing brush, when a bulldozer blade caught something buried in the dirt. The operator stopped, climbed down, and pulled it free. A dog collar. Leather cracked with age, brass buckle tarnished green. He turned it over in his hands, brushed off the dirt, and felt the metal warm under his fingers. He dropped it. Fast. Like it had burned him. His crew chief came over, picked it up, looked at it, and tossed it into the back of a truck with the rest of the debris. By the time they got back to the yard that evening, the collar was gone. No one admitted to taking it. No one knew where it went. It just wasn't there anymore. The highway was built. The area around the Wash was cleared and paved, and the seasonal seep pools were buried under gravel and asphalt. But the stories remained, and the rules remained. People in Arizona still tell their kids not to stop near that stretch of road after dark. Truck drivers who haul freight through the area say the CB radio crackles with static when you pass the old Wash, even though the road is straight and the signal should be clear. And the ranchers who work the land nearby say their dogs won't cross a certain invisible line, won't go past a point where the ground changes from hard pan to the pale, sandy soil that used to mark the edge of the arroyo. Some say Callan lost his dog to coyotes or a mountain lion or simple bad luck in hard country. Some say the dog ran off and died, and the rest was coincidence and exhaustion, and the way men see things that aren't there when they've been alone too long under a wide sky. Some say the Wash was always strange, that the ground there holds something older than memory, and Rook walked into a door that shouldn't have been open and couldn't find his way back. And some don't say anything at all. They just drive past, windows up, radio on, and they don't stop until they're 10 miles clear. But here's the part nobody in Arizona talks about, the part that doesn't fit any of those explanations. The collar keeps coming back. Not every year, not even every decade, but enough that people know. Enough that when a ranch hand or a road worker or a kid on a dirt bike finds a dog collar near the Wash, brass buckle shining, leather warm in their hands, they know what it is, and they know what to do. They put it down. They step back. And they leave. Because whatever took Rook in 1909 is still there. Still waiting. Still marking the ground with smooth sand and warm brass, and the sound of something clinking in the distance, patient as stone, counting the years the way it once counted breaths. Which version makes sense here? The one where a dog ran off and died and men imagined the rest? Or the one where the Wash never let him go and never will? What does it mean that the collar still appears, warm, in a place that's been paved over and built on and forgotten by everyone except the people who live close enough to know better? And why do people in Arizona still teach their children the same rule men learned in 1909? You don't cross that ground alone. You don't answer sounds you can't. See, and you don't ever touch something that shouldn't be warm. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.